The controversy at the state capitol continues into next week over the censuring of State Senator Steve Halloran. The motion to censure Halloran comes after he read a rape passage during debate and inserted Senator John and Michaela Kavanaugh's last name at various points during the reading.
And now lawmakers are considering a resolution of censure against Halloran. Arbella Caracta has the details of today's hearing.
The last time the Nebraska Legislature censured a senator was 1955, according to Senator Ray Aguilar.
The events that transpired last Monday evening demand forceful condemnation of Senator Halloran's actions, which were profoundly offensive and fundamentally disrespectful to this institution and its members.
Senator Steve Halloran of Hastings did not attend Thursday's hearing, though invited. He did provide his written testimony on the matter to 6 News, saying in part, "If I am guilty of anything, it is of working zealously to protect Nebraska's children, exercising my First Amendment right of free speech in debate on the legislative floor." He also pointed to other instances of what he identified as acts of sexual harassment from former Senator Ernie Chambers directed to Senator Julie Slama in 2020 that didn't result in a censure.
And the same people that are trying to silence you now are the ones that pressured me into standing aside and letting it go.
To be clear, this motion does not limit Halloran from speaking freely. It's a formal stance disagreeing with his comments.
Take action. If you are not going to advance it, I deserve to know that, and the people deserve to know that, and we shouldn't have to wait till Tuesday to find out.
Even after Senator Michaela Kavanaugh's comments and after Senator Ray Aguilar thanked her for her courage and composure, he made it clear they wouldn't be giving the issue closure before the weekend.
And I would ask the members of the board to take some time over the weekend to consider the seriousness of this issue. I wish you all a restful and enjoyable Easter weekend.
On your side in Omaha, Bella Caracta, 6 News.
Today's hearing was invite only for testimony. The committee received 269 online comments in favor of censure. 251 people submitted comments against.